Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of Secret Window, Secret Garden. So let's get into it. Amy had suggested he call Dave Newsome, the Tashmore constable. After all, the man might be dangerous. Mort told her he didn't think that would be necessary, at least not yet. But if John Shooter called by again, he would probably give Dave a jingle. After a few more stilted amenities, they hung up. He could tell she was still smarting over his oblique suggestion that Ted might currently be sitting in Morty Bear's chair and sleeping in Morty Bear's bed. But he honestly didn't know how he could have avoided mentioning Ted Miller sooner or later. The man had become a part of Amy's life, after all, and she had called him. That was the thing. She had gotten one of her funny feelings and called him. Mort reached the place where the lakeside path forked, the right-hand branch climbing the steep bank back up to Lake Drive. He took that branch, walking slowly and savoring the fall color. As he came around the final curve in the path and into sight of the narrow ribbon of blacktop, he was somehow not surprised to see the dusty blue station wagon with the Mississippi plates parked there like an oft-whipped dog chained to a tree, nor the lean figure of John Shooter propped against the right front mudguard with his arms folded across his chest. Mort waited for his heartbeat to speed up, for the surge of adrenaline into his body, but his heart went on maintaining its normal beat, and his glands kept their own counsel, which, for the time being, seemed to remain quiet. The sun, which had gone behind a cloud, came out again, and fall colors, which had already been bright, now seemed to burst into flame. His own shadow reappeared, dark and long and clear-cut. Shooter's round black hat looked blacker, his blue shirt bluer, and the air was so clear the man seemed scissored from a swath of reality that was brighter and more vital than the one Mort knew as a rule. And he understood that he had been wrong about his reasons for not calling Dave Newsome. Wrong, or practicing a little deception, on himself as well as on Amy. The truth was that he wanted to deal with the matter himself. Maybe just to prove to myself that there are things I can still deal with, he thought, and started up the hill again toward where John Shooter was leaning against his car and waiting for him. His walk along the lake path had been both long and slow, and Amy's call hadn't been the only thing Mort had thought about as he picked his way over or around the occasional downed tree, or paused to skip the occasional flat stone across the water. As a boy, he had been able to get a really good one, what they called a flatty, to skip as many as 9 times, but today 4 was the most he'd been able to manage. He had also thought about how to deal with Shooter, when and if Shooter turned up again. It was true he had felt a transient. Try that again. It was true he had felt a transient, or maybe not so transient, guilt when he saw how close to identical the 2 stories were. But he had worked that one out. It was only the generalized guilt he guessed all writers of fiction felt from time to time. As for Shooter himself, the only feelings he had were annoyance, anger, and a kind of relief. He was full of an unfocused rage, had been for months. It was good to finally have a donkey to pin this rotten, stinking tail on. Mort had heard the old saw about how, if 400 monkeys banged away on 400 typewriters for 4 million years, one of them would produce the complete works of Shakespeare. He didn't believe it. Even if it were true, John Shooter was no monkey, and he hadn't been alive anywhere near that long, no matter how lined his face was. So, Shooter had copied his story. Why he had picked sowing season was beyond Mort Rainey's powers of conjecture. But he knew that was what had happened because he had ruled out coincidence, and he knew damned well that while he might have stolen that story, like all his others, from the great idea bank of the universe, he most certainly had not stolen it from Mr. John Shooter of the great state of Mississippi. Where, then, had Shooter copied it from? Mort thought. That was the most important question. His chance to expose Shooter as a fake and a cheat might lie buried within the answer to it. There were only two possible answers because Sowing Season had only been published twice, first in Ellery Queen's mystery magazine, and then in his collection, Everybody Drops the Dime. The dates of publication for the short stories in a collection are usually listed on the copyright page at the front of the book, and this format had been followed in Everybody Drops the Dime. He had looked up the acknowledgement for Sowing Season and found that it had been originally published in the June 1980 issue of EQMM. The collection Everybody Drops the Dime had been issued by St. Martin's Press in 1983. There had been subsequent printings since then, all but one of them in paperback, but that didn't matter. All he really had to work with were those two dates, 1980 and 1983, and his own hopeful belief that, aside from agents and publishing company lawyers, no one paid much attention to those lines of fine print on the copyright page. Hoping that this would prove true of John Shooter, hoping that Shooter would simply assume, as most general readers did, that a story he had read for the first time in a collection had no prior existence. Mort approached the man and finally stood before him on the edge of the road. "I guess you must have had a chance to read my story by now," Shooter said. He spoke as casually as a man commenting on the weather. "I did." Shooter nodded gravely. "I imagine it rang a bell, didn't it?" "It certainly did," Mort agreed, and then, with studied casualness, "When did you write it?" "I thought you'd ask that," Shooter said. He smiled a secret little smile, but said no more. His arms remained crossed over his chest, his hands laid against his sides just below the armpits. He looked like a man who would be perfectly content to remain where he was forever, or at least until the sun sank below the horizon and ceased to warm his face. "Well, sure," Mort said, still casually. "I have to. You know. When two fellows show up with the same story, that's serious." "Serious," Shooter agreed in a deep, meditative tone of voice. "And the only way to sort a thing like that out," Mort continued, "to decide who copied from whom, is to find out who wrote the words first." He fixed Shooter's faded blue eyes with his own dry and uncompromising gaze. Somewhere nearby, a chickadee twittered self-importantly in a tangle of trees, and was then quiet again. "Wouldn't you say that's true?" "I suppose I would," Shooter agreed. "I suppose that's why I came all the way up here from Mississippi." Mort heard the rumble of an approaching vehicle. They both turned in that direction, and Tom Greenleaf's Scout came over the nearest hill, pulling a little cyclone of fallen leaves behind it. Tom, a hale and healthy Tashmore, a native of 70-something, was the caretaker for most of the places on this side of the lake that Greg Carstairs didn't handle. Tom raised one hand in salute as he passed. Mort waved back. Shooter removed one hand from its resting place and tipped a finger at Tom in a friendly gesture, which spoke in some obscure way of a great many years spent in the country, of the uncountable and unrecollected number of times he had saluted the passing drivers of passing trucks and tractors and tedders and balers in that exact same casual way. Then, as Tom's scout passed out of sight, he returned his hand to his rib cage so that the arms were crossed again. As the leaves rattled to rest on the road, his patient, unwavering, almost eternal gaze came back to Mort Rainey's face once more. "Now, what were you saying?" he asked almost gently. "We were trying to establish provenance," Mort said. "That means—" "I know what it means," Shooter said, favoring Mort with a glance which was both calm and mildly contemptuous. "I know I am wearing shit-kicker clothes and driving a shit-kicker car, and I come from a long line of shit-kickers. And maybe that makes me a shit-kicker myself, but it doesn't necessarily make me a stupid shit-kicker." "No," Mort agreed. "I don't guess it does. But being smart doesn't necessarily make you honest either. In fact, I think it's more often apt to go the other way." "I could figure that much out of you, had I not known it," Shooter said dryly. And Mort felt himself flush. He didn't like to be zinged and rarely was, but Shooter had just done it with the effortless ease of an experienced shotgunner popping a clay pigeon. His hopes of trapping Shooter dropped. Not all the way to zero, but quite a considerable way. Smart and sharp were not the same things, but he now suspected that Shooter might be both. Still, there was no sense drawing this out. He didn't want to be around the man any longer than he had to be. In some strange way, he had looked forward to this confrontation. Once he had become sure that another confrontation was inevitable, maybe only because it was a break in a routine which had already become dull and unpleasant. Now he wanted it over. He was no longer sure John Shooter was crazy, not completely anyway, but he thought the man could be dangerous. He was so goddamn implacable. He decided to take his best shot and get it over with. No more dancing around. "When did you write your story, Mr. Shooter?" "Maybe. My name's not Shooter," the man said, looking faintly amused. "Maybe that's just a pen name." "I see. What's your real one?" "I didn't say it wasn't. I only said maybe. Either way, that's not part of our business." He spoke serenely, appearing to be more interested in a cloud which was making its way slowly across the high blue sky and toward the westerning sun. "Okay," Mort said, "but when you wrote that story is—" "I wrote it 7 years ago," he said, still studying the cloud. It had touched the edge of the sun now and had acquired a gold fringe. "In 1982. "Bingo," Mort thought. Wily old bastard or not, he stepped right into the trap after all. He got the story out of the collection, all right. And since Everybody Drops the Dime was published in 1983, he thought any date before then had to be safe. Should have read the copyright page, old son. He waited for a feeling of triumph, but there was none. Only a muted sense of relief that this nut could be sent on his merry way with no further fuss or muss. Still, he was curious. It was the curse of the writing class. For instance, why that particular story? A story which was so out of his usual run, so downright atypical. And if the guy was going to accuse him of plagiarism, why settle for an obscure short story when he could have cobbled up the same sort of almost identical manuscript of a bestseller like The Organ Grinder's Boy? That would have been juicy. This was almost a joke. I suppose knocking off one of the novels would have been too much like work, Mort thought. "Why did you wait so long?" he asked. "I mean, my book of short stories was published in 1983, and that's 6 years ago, going on 7 now." Because I didn't know, Shooter said. He removed his gaze from the cloud and studied Mort with that discomforting look of faint contempt again. A man like you? I suppose that kind of man just assumes that everyone in America, if not everyone in every country, where his books are published, reads what he has written. I know better than that, I think, Mort said, and it was his turn to be dry. But that's not true, Shooter went on, ignoring what Mort had said in his scarcely serene and utterly fixated way. That is not true at all. I never saw that story until the middle of June. This June. Mort thought of saying, Well, guess what, Johnny me boy? I never saw my wife in bed with another man until the middle of May. Would it knock Shooter off his pace if he actually did say something like that out loud? He looked into the man's face and decided not. The serenity had burned out of those faded eyes the way mist burns off the hills on a day which is going to be a real scorcher. Now, Shooter looked like a fundamentalist preacher about to ladle a large helping of fire and brimstone upon the trembling, downcast heads of his flock, and for the first time, Mort Rainey felt really and personally afraid of the man. Yet he was also still angry. The thought he'd had near the end of his first encounter with John Shooter now recurred. Scared or not, he was damned if he was just going to stand here and take it while this man accused him of theft, especially now that the falsity had been revealed out of the man's own mouth. Let me guess, Mort said. A guy like you is a little too picky about what he reads to bother with the sort of trash I write. You stick to guys like Marcel Proust and Thomas Hardy, right? At night, after the milking's done, you like to fire up one of those honest country kerosene lamps, plunk it down on the kitchen table, which is, of course, covered with a homey red and white checkered tablecloth, and unwind with a little tess or remembrance of things past. Maybe on weekend you like your hair down a little, get a little funky, and drag out some Erskine Caldwell or Annie Dillard. It was one of your friends who told you about how I'd copied your honestly wrought tale. Isn't that how the story goes, Mr. Shooter? Or whatever your name is. His voice had taken on a rough edge, and he was surprised to find himself on the edge of real fury, but he discovered not totally surprised. Nope, I don't have any friends. Shooter spoke in the dry tone of a man who has only started stating a fact. No friends, no family, no wife. I've got a little place about 20 miles south of Perkinsburg, and I do have a checkered tablecloth on my kitchen table, now that you mention it. But we got electric lights in our town. I only bring out the kerosenes when there's a storm and the lines go out. Good for you, Mort said. Shooter ignored the sarcasm. I got the place from my father, and added to it with a little money that came to me from my gram. I do have a dairy herd, about 20 milkers. You were right about that, too. And in the evenings, I write stories. I suppose you've got one of those fancy computers with a screen, but I make do with an old typewriter. He fell silent, and for a moment they could both hear the crisp rustle of the leaves in the late afternoon wind that had sprung up. As for your story, being the same as mine, I found that out all on my own book. You see, I'd been thinking about selling the farm, thinking that with a little more money, I could write days when my mind's fresh, instead of just after dark. The realtor in Perkinsburg wanted me to meet a fella up in Jackson who owns a lot of dairy farms in Mississippi. I don't like to drive more than 10 or 15 miles at a time. Gives me a headache, especially when it's city driving, because that's where they let all the fools loose. And so I took the bus. I got ready to get on and then remembered I hadn't bought anything to read. I hate a long bus ride without something to read. Mort found himself nodding involuntarily. He also hated a ride, bus, train, plane, or car, without something to read, something a little more substantial than the daily paper. There isn't any bus station in Perkinsburg. The Greyhound just stops at the Rexall for 5 minutes or so, and then it's down the road. I was already inside the door of that hound and starting up the steps when I realized I was empty-handed. I asked the bus driver if he'd hold it for me, and he said he was damned if he could. He was late already, and he was pulling out in another 3 minutes by his pocket watch. If I was with him, that would be fine by him, and if I wasn't, then I would kiss his fanny when we met up again. He talks like a storyteller, Mort thought. Be damned if he doesn't. He tried to cancel this thought. It didn't seem to be a good way to be thinking, and couldn't quite do it. Well, I ran inside that drugstore. They've got one of those old-fashioned wire paperback racks in the Perkinsburg Rexall, the ones that turn around and around, just like the one in the little general store up the road from you. Bowie's? Shooter nodded. That's the place, all right. Anyway, I grabbed the first book my hand happened on. Could have been a paperback Bible for all I saw of the cover, but it wasn't. It was your book of short stories. Everybody drops the dime. And for all I know, they were your short stories. All but that one. Stop this now. He's working up a head of steam, so spike his boiler right now. But he discovered he didn't want to. Maybe Shooter was a writer. He fulfilled both of the main requirements. He told a tale you wanted to hear to the end, even if you had a pretty good idea what the end was going to be. And he was so full of shit he squeaked. Instead of saying what he should have said, that, even if Shooter was by some wild stretch of the imagination telling the truth, he, Mort, had beaten him to that miserable story by 2 years, he said. So, you read Sowing Season on a Greyhound bus while you were going to Jackson to sell your dairy farm last June. No. The way it happened, I read it on the way back. I sold the farm and went back on the Greyhound with a check for $60,000 in my pocket. I'd read the first half a dozen stories going down. I didn't think they were any great shakes, but they passed the time. Thank you. Shooter studied him briefly. Wasn't offering you any real compliment. Don't I know it? Shooter thought about this for a moment, then shrugged. Anyway, I read 2 more going back, and then that one, my story. He looked at the cloud, which was now an airy mass of shimmering gold, and then back at Mort. His face was as dispassionate as ever, but Mort suddenly understood he had been badly mistaken in believing this man possessed even the slightest shred of peace or serenity. What he had mistaken for those things was the iron mantle of control Shooter had donned to keep himself from killing Morton Rainey with his bare hands. The face was dispassionate, but his eyes blazed with the deepest, wildest fury Mort had ever seen. He understood that he had stupidly walked up the path from the lake toward what might really be his own death at this fellow's hands. Here was a man mad enough, in both senses of that word, to do murder. I am surprised no one has taken that story up with you before. It's not like any of the others. Not a bit. Shooter's voice was still even, but Mort now recognized it was the voice of a man laboring mightily to keep from striking out, bludgeoning, perhaps throttling. The voice of a man who knows that all the incentive he would ever need to cross the line between talking and killing would be to hear his own voice begin to spiral upward into the registers of cheated anger. The voice of a man who knows how fatally easy it would be to become his own lynch mob. Mort suddenly felt like a man in a dark room which is crisscrossed with hair-thin tripwires, all of them leading to packets of high explosive. It was hard to believe that only moments ago he had felt in charge of this situation. His problems, Amy, his inability to write, now seemed like unimportant figures in an unimportant landscape. In a sense, they had ceased to be problems at all. He only had one problem now, and that was staying alive long enough to get back to his house, let alone long enough to see the sun go down. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing he dared to say. Not now. The room was full of tripwires. I am very surprised, Shooter repeated in that heavy, even voice that now sounded like a hideous parody of calmness. Mort heard himself say, My wife, she didn't like it. She said that it wasn't like anything I'd ever written before. How did you get it? Shooter asked slowly and fiercely. That's what I really wanted to know. How in hell did a big money scribbling asshole like you get down to a little shit-spat town in Mississippi and steal my goddamn story? I'd like to know why, too. Unless you stole all the other ones as well. But the how of it'll be enough to satisfy me right now. The monstrous unfairness of this brought Mort's own anger back like an unslanked thirst. For a moment, he forgot that he was out here on Lake Drive, alone, except for this lunatic from Mississippi. Drop it, he said harshly. Drop it? Shooter asked, looking at Mort with a kind of clumsy amazement. Drop it? What in the hell do you mean, drop it? You said you wrote your story in 1982, Mort said. I think I wrote mine in late 1979. I can't remember the exact date, but I do know that it was published for the first time in June of 1980 in a magazine. I beat you by 2 years, Mr. Shooter, or whatever your name is. If anybody here has got a bitch about plagiarism, it's me. Mort did not precisely see the man move. At one moment, they were standing by Shooter's car, looking at each other. At the next, he found himself pressed against the driver's door with Shooter's hands wrapped around his upper arms and Shooter's face pressed against his own, forehead to forehead. In between his two positions, there was only a blurred sensation of being first grabbed and then whirled. You lie, Shooter said, and on his breath was a dry whiff of cinnamon. The fuck I do, Mort said, and lunged forward against the man's pressing weight. Shooter was strong, almost certainly stronger than Mort Rainey, but Mort was younger, heavier, and he had the old blue station wagon to push against. He was able to break Shooter's hold and send him stumbling 2 or 3 steps backwards. Now he'll come for me, Mort thought, although he hadn't had a fight since a schoolyard. You pull me down and I'll push you scuffle back in the 4th grade. He was astounded to find his mind was clear and cool. We're going to duke it out over that dumb fucking story. Well, okay. I wasn't doing anything else today anyhow. But it didn't happen. Shooter raised his hands, looked at them, saw they were knotted into fists, and forced them to open. Mort saw the effort it took for the man to reimpose that mantle of control, and felt a kind of awe. Shooter put one of his open palms to his mouth and wiped his lips with it. very slowly and very deliberately. "Prove it," he said. "All right. Come back to the house with me. I'll show you the entry on the copyright page of the book." "No," Shooter said. "I don't care about the book. I don't care a pin for the book. Show me the story. Show me the magazine with the story in it, so I can read it for myself." "I don't have the magazine here." He was about to say something else, but Shooter turned his face up toward the sky and uttered a single bark of laughter. The sound was as dry as an axe splitting kindling wood. "No," he said. The fury was still blazing and dancing in his eyes, but he seemed in charge of himself again. "No, I bet you don't." "Listen to me," Mort said. "Ordinarily, this is just a place my wife and I come in the summer. I have copies of my books here and some foreign editions, but I've published in a lot of magazines as well, articles and essays as well as stories. Those magazines are in our year-round house, the one in Derry." "Then why aren't you there?" Shooter asked. In his eyes, Mort read both disbelief and a galling satisfaction. It was clear that Shooter had expected him to try and squirm his way out of it, and in Shooter's mind, that was just what Mort was doing, or trying to do. "I'm here because—" He stopped. "How did you know I'd be here?" "I just looked on the back of the book I bought," Shooter said, and Mort could have slapped his own forehead in frustration and sudden understanding. Of course! There had been a picture of him on the back of both the hardcover and paperback editions of Everybody Drops the Dime. Amy had taken it herself, and it had been an excellent shot. He was in the foreground. The house was in the middle distance. Tashmore Lake was in the background. The caption had read simply, "Morton Rainey at his home in Western Maine." So Shooter had come to Western Maine, and he probably hadn't had to visit too many small-town bars and or drugstores before he found someone who said, "Mort Rainey? Hell yes! Got a place over in Tashmore. Personal friend of mine, in fact." Well, that answered one question anyway. "I'm here because my wife and I got a divorce," he said. "It just became final. She stayed in Derry. Any other year, the house down here would have been empty." "Uh-huh," Shooter said. His tone of voice infuriated Mort all over again. "You're lying," it said, "but in this case it doesn't much matter, because I knew you'd lie. After all, lying is mostly what you're about, isn't it?" "Well, I would have found you, one place or the other." He fixed Mort with a flinty stare. "I would have found you if you'd moved to Brazil." "I believe that," Mort said. "Nevertheless, you are mistaken, or conning me. I'll do you the courtesy of believing it's only a mistake, because you seem sincere enough." Oh God, didn't he? "But I published that story 2 years before you say you wrote it." He saw that mad flash in Shooter's eyes again, and then it was gone. Not extinguished, but collared, the way a man might collar a dog with an evil nature. "You say this magazine is at your other house?" "Yes." "And the magazine has your story in it?" "Yes." "And the date of that magazine is June 1980? "Yes." Mort had felt impatient with his laborious cachism. There was a long, thoughtful pause before each question. At first, but now he felt a little hope. It was as if the man was trying to teach himself the truth of what Mort had said. A truth, Mort thought, that part of John Shooter must have known all along, because the almost exact similarity between the two stories was not coincidence. He still believed that firmly, but he had come around to the idea that Shooter might have no conscious memory of committing the plagiarism, because the man was clearly mad. He wasn't quite as afraid as he had been when he first saw the hate and fury dancing in Shooter's eyes, like the reflection of a barn fire blazing out of control. When he pushed the man, he had staggered backward, and Mort thought that if it came to a fight, he could probably hold his own, or actually put this man on the ground. Still, it would be better if it didn't come to that. In an odd backhand sort of way, he had begun to feel a bit sorry for Shooter. That gentleman, meanwhile, was stolidly pursuing his course. This other house, the one your wife has now, it's been here in Maine, too? Yes. She's there? Yes. There was a much longer pause this time. In a weird way, Shooter reminded Mort of a computer processing a heavy load of information. At last, he said, I'll give you 3 days. It's very generous of you, Mort said. Shooter's long upper lip drew back from teeth too even to be anything but mail-order dentures. Don't you make light of me, son, he said. I'm trying my best to hold my temper, and doing a pretty good job of it, but... You, Mort cried at him. What about me? This is unbelievable. You come out of nowhere and make just about the most serious accusation a man can make against a writer, and when I tell you I've got proof, you're either mistaken or lying through your damn teeth. You start patting yourself on the back for holding your temper. Unbelievable. Shooter's eyelids drooped, giving him a sly look. Proof, he said. I don't see no proof. I hear you talking. But talking ain't proof. I told you, Mort shouted. He felt helpless, like a man trying to box cobwebs. I explained all that. Shooter looked at Mort for a long moment, then turned and reached through the open window of his car. What are you doing? Mort asked, his voice tight. Now, he felt the adrenaline dump into his body, readying him for a fight or flight. Probably the latter, if Shooter was reaching for the big handgun Mort suddenly saw in the eye of his imagination. Just getting my smokes, Shooter said. Hold your water. When he pulled his arm out of the car, he had a red package of Pall Malls in his hand. He had taken them off the dashboard. Want one? I have my own, Mort said rather sulkily, and took the ancient pack of L&Ms from the pocket beneath the red flannel overshirt. They lit up, each from his own pack. If we keep on this way, we're going to have a fight, Shooter said finally. I don't want that. Well, Jesus, neither do I. Part of you does, Shooter contradicted. He continued to study Mort from beneath his dropped lids with that expression of country shrewdness. Part of you wants just that. But I don't think it's just me or my story that's making you want to fight. You have got some other bee under your blanket that's got you all riled up, and that is making this harder. Part of you wants to fight, but what you don't understand is that if we do start the fight, it's not going to end until one or the other of us is dead. Mort looked for signs that Shooter was exaggerating for effect and saw none. He suddenly felt cold along the base of his spine. So I'm going to give you 3 days. You call your ex and get her to send down the magazine with your story in it, if there is such a magazine, and I'll be back. There isn't any magazine, of course. I think we both know that. But you strike me as a man who needs to do some long, hard thinking. He looked at Mort with a disconcerting expression of stern pity. You You didn't believe anybody would ever catch you out, did you? He asked. You really didn't. If I show you the magazine, will you go away? Mort asked. He was speaking more to himself than to Shooter. I guess what I really want to know is whether or not it's even worth it. Shooter abruptly opened his car door and slid in behind the wheel. Mort found the speed with which the man could move a little creepy. 3 days. Use it the way you like, Mr. Rainey. He started the engine. It ran with the low wheeze characteristic of valves, which need to be reground, and the tang of oil smoke from the old tailpipe polluted the air of the fading afternoon. Right is right, and fair is fair. The first thing is to get you to a place where you see I have really got you, and you can't wiggle out of this mess the way you've probably been wriggling out of the messes you have made all your life. That's the first thing. He looked at Mort expressionlessly, out of the driver's side window. The second thing, he said, is the reason I come. What's that? Mort heard himself say. It was strange and not a little infuriating, but he felt that sensation of guilt creeping relentlessly over him again. And if he had really done the thing of which this rustic lunatic was accusing him. We'll talk about it, Shooter said, and threw his elderly station wagon in gear. Meantime, you think about what's right and what's fair. You're nuts, Mort shouted, but Shooter was already rolling up Lake Drive toward where it spilled out into Route 23. He watched until the wagon was out of sight, then walked slowly back to the house. It felt emptier and emptier in his mind as he drew closer and closer to it. The rage and the fear were gone. He felt only cold, tired, and homesick for a marriage which no longer was, and which, it now began to seem to him, had never been at all. The telephone started ringing when he was halfway along the driveway which ran down the steep hill from Lake Drive to the house. Mort broke into a run, knowing he wasn't going to make it, but running anyway, cursing himself for his foolish reaction. Talk about Pavlov's dogs. He had opened the screen door and was fumbling with the knob of the inside door when the phone silenced. He stepped in, closed the door behind him, and looked at the telephone, which stood on a little antique desk Amy had picked up at a flea market in Mechanic Falls. He could, in that moment, easily imagine that the phone was looking back at him with studied mechanical impatience. Don't ask me, boss. I don't make the news. I only report it. He thought that he ought to buy one of those machines that takes messages. Or maybe not. When he thought about it carefully, he realized that the telephone was hardly his favorite gadget. If people really wanted you, they eventually called back. He made himself a sandwich and a bowl of soup, and then discovered he didn't want them. He felt lonely, unhappy, and mildly infected by John Shooter's craziness. He was not much surprised to find that the sum of these feelings was sleepiness. He began to cast longing glances at the couch. Okay, an interior voice whispered. Remember, though, you can run, but you can't hide. The shit is still gonna be here when you wake up. That was very true, he thought, but in the meantime, it would all be gone. Gone. Blessedly gone. The one thing you could definitely say for short-term solutions was that they were better than nothing. He decided he would call home. His mind persisted in thinking of the dairy house as home, and he suspected that was a circumstance which would not soon change. Ask Amy to pull the copy of EQMM with sewing season in it and send it down by express mail. Then he would sack on the couch for a couple of hours. He would arise around 7 or so, go into the study refreshed, and write a little more shit. And shit is all you will write with that attitude, the interior voice reproached him. Fuck you, Mort told it. one of the few advantages to living alone, so far as he could see, was that you could talk to yourself right out loud without having anyone wonder if you were crazy or what. He picked up the phone and dialed the Derry number. He listened to the customary clicks of the long-distance connection being made, and then that most irritating of all telephone sounds, the da-da-da of a busy signal. Amy was on the telephone with someone, and when Amy really got going, a conversation could go on for hours, possibly days. Oh, fuck. Great, Mort cried, and jacked the handset back into the cradle hard enough to make the bell jingle faintly. So, what now, little man? He supposed he could call Isabel Fortin, who lived across the street, but that suddenly seemed like too much work and a pain in the ass besides. Isabel was already so deeply into his and Amy's breakup that he was doing everything but taking home movies. Also, it was already past 5 o'clock. The magazine couldn't actually start to move along the postal channel between Derry and Tashmore until tomorrow morning, no matter what time it was mailed today. He would try Amy later on the evening, and if the line to the house was busy again, or if Amy was, perchance, still on the same call, he would call Isabel with the message after all. For the moment, the siren song of the couch in the living room was too strong to be denied. Mort pulled the phone jack. Whoever had tried to call him, just as he was coming down the driveway, would have to wait a little longer, please and thank you, and strolled into the living room. He propped the pillows in their familiar positions, one behind his head and one behind his neck, and looked out at the lake, where the sun was setting at the end of a long and spectacular golden track. I have never felt so lonely and so utterly horrible in my whole life, he thought, with some amazement. Then his lids closed slowly over his slightly bloodshot eyes, and Mort Rainey, who had yet to discover what true horror was all about, fell asleep. He dreamed he was in a classroom. It was a familiar classroom, although he couldn't have said just why. He was in the classroom with John Shooter. Shooter was holding a grocery bag in the curve of one arm. He took an orange out of the bag and bounced it reflectively up and down in his hand. He was looking in Mort's direction, but not at Mort. His gaze seemed fixed on something beyond Mort's shoulder. Mort turned and saw a cinder block wall and a blackboard, and a door with a frosted glass upper panel. After a moment, he could puzzle out the backward writing on the frosted glass. "Welcome to the School of Hard Knocks," it said. The writing on the blackboard was easier to read. "Sewing Season, a short story by Morton Rainey," it said. Suddenly, something whizzed over Mort's shoulder, just missing his head. The orange. As Mort cringed back, the orange struck the blackboard, burst open with a rotten squashing sound, and splattered gore across what had been written there. He turned back to Shooter. "Stop that!" he cried in a shaky, scolding voice. Shooter dipped into his bag again. "What's the matter?" Shooter asked him in his calm, stern voice. "Don't you recognize blood oranges when you see 'em? What kind of writer are you?" He threw another one. It splattered crimson across Mort's name and began to drip slowly down the wall. "No more!" Mort screamed, but Shooter dipped slowly and implicably into the bag again. His long, calloused fingers sank into the skin of the orange he brought out. Blood began to sweat its way onto the orange's skin in pinprick droplets. "No more! No more, please, no more. I'll admit it. I'll admit anything, everything, if you just stop. Anything, if you'll just stop. If you'll stop. If you'll just stop." He was falling. Mort grabbed at the edge of the couch just in time to save himself a short and probably painful trip to the living room floor. He rolled toward the back of the couch and simply lay there for a moment, clutching the cushions, shivering, and trying to grasp at the ragged tails of the dream. Something about a classroom and blood oranges and the school of hard knocks. Even this was going, and the rest was already gone. It had been real, whatever it was. Much too real. At last, he opened his eyes, but there was precious little to see. He had slept until long past sundown. He was horribly stiff, especially at the base of his neck, and he suspected he had been asleep at least 4 hours, maybe 5. He felt his way cautiously to the living room light switch, managing to avoid the octagonal glass-topped coffee table for a change. He had an idea the coffee table was semi-sentient, and given to shifting its position slightly after dark, the better to hack away at his shins. And then went into the front hall to try Amy again. On the way, he checked his watch. It was 10:15. He had slept over 5 hours, nor was this the first time. And he wouldn't even pay for it by tossing and turning all night. Judging by past experience, he would be asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow in the bedroom. He picked up the phone, was momentarily puzzled by the dead silence in his ear, then remembered he had yanked the damn thing's fang. He pulled the wire through his fingers until it got to the jack, turned around to plug it in, and paused. From here he could look out the small window to the left of the door. This gave him an angle of vision on the back porch, where the mysterious and unpleasant Mr. Shooter had left his manuscript under a rock yesterday. He could also see the garbage cabinet, and there was something on it. 2 somethings, actually. A white something and a dark something. The dark something looked nasty. For one frightening second, Mort thought a giant spider was crouched there. He dropped the phone cord and turned on the porch light in a hurry. Then there was a space of time. He didn't know just how long and didn't care to know when he was incapable of further movement. The white thing was a sheet of paper, a perfectly ordinary 8.5 by 11 sheet of typing paper. Although the garbage cabinet was a good 15 feet away from where Mort was standing, the few words on it were printed in large strokes, and he could read them easily. He thought Shooter must have used either a pencil with an extremely soft lead or a piece of artist's charcoal. "Remember, you have 3 days," the message read. "I am not joking." The black thing was Bump. Shooter had apparently broken the cat's neck before nailing him to the roof of the garbage cabinet with a screwdriver from Mort's own tool shed. That's it for this week. We will see you guys next week with part 3.